Hi, and welcome to the Bible, My Cats and I. Zoe is here hanging out with me today, so the camera might rock if she gets a little crazy, but I think she's just going to go off and fall asleep. But there's my baby girl. She's shedding like crazy, and I'm going to have hairs all over my black suit. I don't know why I did this just now. Here you go, sweetheart. Here you go. I'm so looking forward to our continued study of the book of Matthew. We're only in chapter 2, but here we go. We're going to be learning a little bit more about what Matthew has to say about Jesus and his life and ministry on this planet. So let's just go ahead and get straight started. What do you think of when you think of the story of Jesus' birth? Usually what comes to mind is pictures of those pageants or what have you, with angels and shepherds and the three kings. They all come to where this baby is lying in a manger. And those are familiar elements, but not all of them come from the book of Matthew, only part of them. Others of that story come from the book of the Gospel of Luke. What we hear from Matthew are parts about the Magi and about King Herod. And there's great many elements to just Matthew's version of this story. Zoe is climbing the curtains. I'm very sorry for the interruption. Get down. Get down. Good girl. That's why it's the Bible, My Cats and I. Anyway, there are a great many elements to Matthew's version of this story, and we're going to just look at some of them. I can't include everything, but there are stories about outsiders becoming insiders. There's great intrigue. There's clash of power, and there's the tyranny of authority. There's tragedy, and there's secrecy. There's all of this in chapter 2, believe it or not, of Matthew. So we're going to look at just a part of that. In each one of these lessons, we're going to study a chapter per lesson, and I can't possibly cover the entire chapter in one lesson. And if I did, oh my goodness, we'd be here forever. So I'm going to pull out just one part of each chapter and go a little bit deeper into that. So today, what I want to do is cover this story that the author of Matthew offers us about the Magi and their visit to the Christ child. So if you haven't read that story already, if you haven't read the chapter 2 of Matthew, push the pause button. And I'm laughing because she's still climbing the curtains. Press the pause button, read chapter 2, and come back to me after you've done that. If you've already read it, here we go. The Magi. First of all, how is it that according to Matthew, Mary and Joseph end up in Bethlehem? See, in Matthew's story, we don't find anything about a census or a need for an inn or, any of those elements. How did they end up in Bethlehem? Well, what's of interest to Matthew is the fulfillment of prophecy. And there is prophecy in the Old Testament, in the Jewish scriptures, about the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. And so that's why we read in Matthew that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, to show that fulfillment of prophecy. Now, when the Magi visit Jesus, Jesus was still very young, but it probably, according to Matthew, probably was not right as he was born. It was probably a little bit after he was born. Not necessarily that very night, all right? It was definitely before King Herod died, and so very early on in Jesus' life. And so we think that this story, this account probably happened between the year 1 and the year 4 BC. All right? So who were the Magi? Well, Magi comes from the same root word as magic, believe it or not. There are those who believe that perhaps these were Zoroastrian priests, and that's very, very possible, actually. But they weren't necessarily kings. We have that tradition of calling them the three kings. Well, actually, it doesn't say anything about how many there were, and Matthew never calls them kings. We'll get back to that in a minute. Another important thing is that they were not Jewish. That's really interesting. They were from the east, it does say, probably from Babylonia. And why do I say that? Well, again, Matthew is interested in the fulfillment of scriptures. I'm going to take you to Psalm 87. I'm just going to read the very first part, and you'll see why this was important to the author of Matthew. Psalm 87 says, "He has founded his city on the holy mountain." And by the way, Bethlehem is there. "The Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all other dwellings of Jacob. Glorious things are said of you, city of God. I will record Rahab and Babylon," there it is, "among those who acknowledge me. Philistia too, and Tyre, along with Cush, and will say, this one was born in Zion." So you see why it was important that Matthew pointed out these Magi were from Babylonia, from the east, he says. Okay, we know that they followed stars, it says there. So we know that they were open to what's called God's general revelation. Well, let me explain to you what I mean by that. There are three different kinds of revelation. There's general revelation, which is, well, what is revealed about God within creation itself. So this is like when you stand at the ocean and the waves touch your feet, or you look at your hand and you just somehow know that this is evidence of somehow some intelligent divine design of the universe with love. All right, that's general revelation, and that's open to all people. Then there's what's called special revelation, the second kind of revelation, and that would be a divine contact, if you will, a direct contact with the divine. That can be through the Holy Scriptures, that can be through visions or dreams or prayers or words of knowledge. All of that is considered special revelation, where we learn about God through that. And then the third kind of revelation, well, is that we find God in Christ himself. Christ being the perfect representation for God. He was God in the flesh, and so we know about God's character. We know that through knowing Christ. Okay, well, the Magi apparently were open to all three because they looked at general revelation, the stars, and read what God was doing in the world at the time through that. And they were open to special revelation because we read about in chapter 2 how they knew the Jewish scriptures and they knew that there was a Messiah to be born, or a king to be born, in Bethlehem. And they also went to ask some more questions about this of King Herod. And then, of course, they were open to the third kind of revelation, to Christ himself, because they were there to see the Christ child himself. Now, why have these been called kings? I said I would get to that, so here we go. Let me take you to Psalm 72. All right, I'll read this to you. This is considered a royal psalm, so it's about the king himself. It's considered to have been written by Solomon himself. But it also is considered a messianic text in that Jesus was the King of Kings. So read it, we Christians will read it from that perspective, this royal psalm 72. I'm just going to skip to verse 8 and read from there. It says here, "May he rule from sea to sea, and from the river," the Euphrates, think Babylon, okay? So it says, "from the river to the ends of the earth. May the desert tribes bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish, kings, and of distant shores, bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts. May all kings bow down to him, and all nations serve him." So I believe Matthew doesn't point this out, but this is one of the reasons why tradition calls the Magi kings, is because they apparently bowed down before the child. We recall this text and we think about, oh, it was expected that kings would bow down before him. So that's where that tradition came from. There's another text from Isaiah. This is also considered a messianic prophetic text. Isaiah 60, and this is verse 1 through 3. I'll read it. You may be familiar with it because it's words to a song. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears to you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Again, this is probably where that tradition about these being three kings comes from. But what we really know from the text of Matthew is that they were some kind of a combination of astronomers and astrologers, and they were definitely outsiders of the race, meaning they were Gentiles, and they were also outsiders of the Jewish religion, even though they did have some knowledge, apparently, of the Hebrew texts. So think about it this way. Today, these Magi would probably be kind of comparable to those who follow New Age religion. Oh, doesn't that sound subversive? So the religious elite at the time would think about this in the same way that you might think about people who follow New Age. Outsiders, definitely, from the Christian religion. And you might even have some sort of a lean towards, oh, that's really evil. Why is this significant in the understanding of this coming of Christ? Well, because it shows that God even called the outsiders and brought them in to the birth of Christ. And so it was the outsiders who were in the know about this birth and the coming of God, even more so than the insiders. They were the ones invited to the party, if you will. And Hosea, one of the prophets of the Hebrew scriptures, mentions this also. And I think this is one of the reasons why Matthew chose to include these outsiders in his story about the birth of Jesus. Hosea chapter 2:23 says this, I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one. I will say to those called not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. God chose where these Magi were at the time to bring him to himself. As I said, they were the ones invited to the party. Now, we can be critical about the thinking and the faith practices and beliefs of those who may believe in different things than ourselves. But this text shows that we should have a heart for those who follow even idolatrous paths and believe that God certainly can adapt his message to reach out to them in ways that they would understand, to lead them to the Christ. Magi, the scholars of the stars, were brought to Christ by a star. Fishermen were brought to Christ by fish. I ask you, what brought you to Christ? What did God use to bring you to Christ? And how might you be a star to others to help lead them to Christ? Well, it says here in chapter 2 of Matthew that the Magi went back to Herod to ask a little more about the Jewish scriptures and the beliefs about the coming king. But later, they were given by divine revelation the understanding of just how subversive and what a threat this was to that king, to King Herod. And so they chose, instead of going back and telling King Herod where the Christ child was found, it says here, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. They went home by another way. Don't we all do that after having been encountered by the Christ? Don't we all go home by another way and live another way? In our life with God and in our life with others, don't we all go home by another way after we've met the Christ? In what ways might you go home by another way this week? In what ways may you choose to live your life differently this week because you have had an encounter with Jesus, the Christ? I'm going to leave you with that thought to ponder. And we thank Matthew for these words. We thank Matthew for the inspiration they have given us to think about that. So I say now, may you go in peace and grace and with great blessings this week. Go forth by another way.